The best World War II movie ever made is entitled Since You Went Away. I'll get back to that. All this month we're building up to Consecration Sunday. We're asking the question, what is God calling me to do? That's a really tough question. I mean, it's not always really clear what God's calling you to do. I know. I was first called to Christ in the Antioch Baptist Church in Columbus, Mississippi. It was revival time, and my mother made sure we were going to church every night that week. I remember feeling like I was being called to Christ on the first night, but how could you really be sure? And to do that, you had to make that long walk all the way down front. And that was a really long walk for a little kid. So the second night, I asked my mother if I could sit on the front row so I could hear better. I remember being so nervous that I kept winding my Mickey Mouse watch until the spring broke. I didn't know what to do, so the third night, I was back on the front row just so I could hear better. And I really didn't know what to do, so I made a deal with God. I said, God, if they sing more than 4 verses, I'm there. Now, you have to understand something about the Baptist church. At the end of their service, at the end of the sermon, they sing a hymn. It's called the altar call. And it gives everyone a chance to take that long walk down the front and dedicate or rededicate their life to Christ. Well, I was in position, but I was still a little hesitant. So I made that deal with God and said, if they sing more than 4 verses, I'm there. Well, if you're a kid in a Baptist church at revival time, you may be under the misconception that the minister is being paid by how many people come down front. Because if it's a slow night, they will sing all 4 verses, repeat number 1 and 2 for emphasis, and hum number 3 just for insurance. They want to make sure that everyone has a chance to make that walk down front. Well, that night they sang 4 plus 2. I walked down front, and I guess that's how I got here today. By the way, I still wear a Mickey Mouse watch. I have my entire life. But now they run on batteries, so I can't overwind them and break the spring when I get nervous, like today. So what is God calling us to do? I mean, we know that everything we have comes from God. But what does He expect us to do with it? How does He expect us to give our resources, our family, our work, even our country to God? That's our focus this month as we head toward Consecration Sunday. So, back to the movie. Since You Went Away is the best World War II movie ever made. You have to trust me on this. I mean, I spent 34 years in uniform serving in the United States military, so I'm an expert. By the way, at the end of the movie, it also becomes the best Christmas movie ever made. Once again, you have to trust me on this. I have been through 60 straight Christmases. I've never missed a one. The movie stars Jennifer Jones, Shirley Temple as a teenager, Claudette Colbert, Joseph Cotton, and Robert Walker. And it was nominated for 9 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, Best Supporting Actor, and 5 others. And the best part about it, it's in black and white. Now, it did win an Academy Award in 1945, but I'm a little embarrassed to tell you that it won an Academy Award for the Best Original Music Score. You see, there was another movie out in 1945 called Going My Way with Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby plays a priest. He plays a priest a lot like Patrick, except the obvious difference is that Bing Crosby can sing. Had it not been for Bing Crosby and the fact that all of the really good war critics were deployed overseas during the war, I'm convinced that Since You Went Away would have won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1945, period. It's about life on the home front and the conflicts and struggle that a family goes through when their father and husband is deployed off to war. They take in a boarder to help ends meet. The mother goes to work in an aircraft factory as Rosie the Riveter, as so many women did in World War II to help win that war. The oldest daughter volunteers with the wounded at the Red Cross, and the youngest daughter collects rubber and paper and tin for the war effort. And the entire time they're sort of growing up. And then one day a telegram arrives. The telegram that says that their father and husband is missing in action. And they learn to deal with loss. You see, this movie is about a constant conflict between those who think that service and sacrifice are a burden and an inconvenience, and those who understand that service and sacrifice are the price of freedom. It's about life. It's about struggle. It's about sacrifice. And it's about service. Not service to the military, but service to each other, service to our nation, and service to our God. You watch this movie and you ask yourself, how can they continue to struggle day after day after day? Sometimes when you look around the community, you ask yourself the same question. How can they continue to struggle day after day after day? I believe that the only thing that makes struggle bearable is hope, and this movie is about hope. It's about hope that their loved ones come home safely. It's about hope for a better tomorrow for their children. And it's about hope that everything will just turn out okay. The Bible tells us in Romans that hope will not disappoint because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts through the Holy Spirit. That's what we have to remember. There are people going through those same struggles today. They're standing watch deployed overseas for you and for me. They're standing watch to ensure that the freedom and hope that God promised us comes true. They're serving others. But we sang that song today just a moment ago to remind us that it's not just people in the military who serve. As the song says, it's the doctor, the shepherdess, the soldier, and the priest. And since I made fun of Patrick singing, I'm certainly not going to break out into song. But you know where you can find them. In the school, in the store, in the street, or in the house next door. These are the saints of God, and I want to be one too. In this church, you can find them in the vestry, on Saturday morning at the food pantry feeding our hungry neighbors. You can find them out front welcoming visitors, or in the back between services in the kitchen. You can find them teaching Sunday school and leading the youth group in the building next door. You can find them building manna bags and building snack packs or reading to children at James Madison Elementary. It's people like Karen Vandenberg and Doug Daniels and Robert Rogers and Barbara Black. These are the saints of God, and there's no reason I can't be one too. You see, I believe that people serve their church, their community, and their nation for the same reason. It's one way to answer the question, what is God calling me to do? I believe that people serve their church, community, and nation also because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves. They want to be part of an idea. I believe that America is more of an idea than it is a place. And there are a lot of people who want to be part of that idea. I think Thornton Wilder captured the idea of America better than anyone else in his play Our Town. I was actually in Our Town in college when Holly and I first met. Now, my part was nothing to write home to Mom about because, well, I played a dead person. But as a dead person, I actually had a few lines. Thornton Wilder won a Pulitzer Prize for his play in his depiction of a typical American town called Grosvenor's Corners. And in the play, the narrator, he's called the stage manager. In one scene, he's describing their graveyard. He talks about the older graves over here and the new section. And in the back, some veterans' graves with iron crosses on their tombstones. Boys who had never been more than 50 miles away from their home. He says, all they knew was a name, friends. The United States of America. The United States of America. And they went and died for it. They were called to something bigger than themselves. They were called to the idea of the United States of America. In Galatians, it tells us that we were born for freedom, but through love, we should serve one another. As we march toward Consecration Sunday, you're going to ask the question, what is God calling me to do? What part of what God has given me does He expect me to give back to His glory? But I ask you to think a little broader. Ask yourself how. How can I give my wealth to God? How can I give my family to God? And how can I give my country to God? How can I become part of something bigger than myself? Freedom and hope. That's what makes Since You Went Away the best World War II movie ever made. It's God's gift to us and what lifts us up every day in service to one another. So we have to ask, what is God calling us to do?
Who'd have thunk it? Who'd have thunk it? I wonder if my grandparents would have thought that. Even though they didn't speak English very well, they probably wouldn't have said it that way. But who'd have thunk it that this youngest grandchild of Japanese immigrants, fishermen and farmers, would co-preach with the Lieutenant General of the United States military, right? My grandparents immigrated in the early 1900s, 1904, 1905. One set on the West Coast, my mother's parents on the West Coast as fishermen in LA, and my dad's parents eventually made their way down to deep South Texas by the Rio Grande River. They were farmers. And growing up, in my grandmother's house were two iconic pictures. One is a picture that everyone probably would have known, but the other was really found in about 50 or 60 families in the valley. There were about 50 or 60 Japanese families that were farmers down in the valley, all the way from Rio Grande City to deep south in Brownsville. And my grandmother, when I was a little boy, I would travel with my grandmother as she visited some of the older Japanese families. One by one, she'd make her way. And really, in all the families, I saw the same picture. Saw it in my grandmother's house. I saw it in my aunt's house. I saw it in all these different farming families. Even in my house, there was a picture. And the picture is this joyous picture in a banquet room. About 40 or 50 of the families. And it's it has to be at least 50 years old because I saw it when I was a little boy. And I finally asked my mother, why do all these families have this picture in their house? It turns out it was in a big banquet room down in the Rio Grande Valley, and it was taken probably in the 1952, 1953. And it was a celebration event. And during the early 1900s, late 1800s, there was an exclusion act that said that those from the East, Chinese and the Japanese, and those from Eastern Europe, part of Eastern Europe, were not allowed to become United States citizens. They could only become permanent residents or permanent alien status. That's the status they were given. Their children being born here were American citizens. So in this picture are all these families that are smiling or laughing and having a good time. Some were in the valley from the very beginning, in the early 1900s, and some families were from the West Coast. And they came later on after the war in the West Coast because they were removed from the West Coast and put into prison camp with barbed wire and machine guns and dogs and guard towers and all that. They were removed from the West Coast because they had Japanese blood in them. And so some of these families are from the West Coast whose also sons served in the military. My family, my mom's family, had sons that were in the United States military. Some even died there. But in the camps, they were Japanese citizens. My mom and her siblings were American citizens. Japanese citizens because they were excluded. So in 1952, there was a Warren, Senator Warren, who had an act that said we are going to abolish that exclusion. And that in 1952, for those of you that want to be naturalized citizens, you have the right now to be naturalized citizens of the United States of America. And so this picture is a picture of that celebration when they all became naturalized citizens of this great country. And they celebrated it. Because when they were young kids, when they were in their teens and when they were in their 20s is when most of them came over to the United States, looking for freedom, looking for hope, looking for that piece of life that would give them meaning and ground them. And so they came to the United States looking for that, like many immigrants, like many ethnic groups did. When I moved to the Los Angeles area for a few years just to do some graduate work, I heard a phrase that I had heard when I was a little boy. It goes like this: Kodomo ni tame. Now, I don't speak Japanese much except for counting 1 through 10. I can do that. Kodomo ni tame. And what it meant was, for the sake of the children, for the sake of the children. That is what the first generation of Japanese, when they came to the United States, said. That was their mantra, that they would sacrifice everything, that they would work their fingers to the bone, not for themselves, but for their children, and that it would be passed on to their children. That's stewardship, isn't it? That is what we are doing in this, not just this month, but like the Professor Jennings from last Sunday, every Sunday is a consecration Sunday. And we are building something not just for us, but for our children and for our children's children. There's another iconic picture that hung in my grandmother's house. And it's Michelangelo's picture, The Last Supper. We've all seen The Last Supper. And I've always wondered, why does she have a picture of this banquet and the picture, well, of this banquet? And it turns out that, I don't know much about my grandmother's faith, but it turns out there were some church members from a local Baptist church that found their way, eventually made their way down to some of the river farms and had a chance to share their faith with people that lived on the farms down in the valley. And if it wasn't for those two unknown, nameless Baptist, whatever they did for a living, sharing their faith with my grandmother, I'm not sure I would be here. I'm not sure I would be here. What is God calling us to do? He's calling us first to worship and to glorify Him. That is the first and foremost thing that He is calling us to do. But how do we live that out? Do we just sit in a pew, or do we just give God just a little bit, a couple hours on a Sunday, and that's it? Or is He calling us to invest? Not just our financial resources, but our talents and our time to invest into people. To have that investment and relationship with God, that you would be able to walk through farms and tell the story of Jesus Christ and what it means to freedom and hope. October 18th, on a Wednesday, and a few days from now, I'm traveling to Houston, Texas, at West University Baptist Church at 10 a.m. in the morning. And I will officiate and preach at a burial service of a Navy commander in the SEAL Team 3 who died. I'm not going to talk about his Naval Academy graduation or his SEAL training or his Bronze Stars or Silver Stars or commendation from the Marines and the Navy and the United States Army. I'm going to talk about this young boy who came from a very dysfunctional family, a tough childhood, who couch surfed throughout his high school days with numerous families, who, even though he looked like this gorgeous California surfer with blonde hair and blue eyes and a build like nobody else, longed to be loved, longed to be found worthy of somebody. I'm going to talk about the body of Christ, these nameless, faceless people who shared, who invested their financial resources, their times, their families, their couches, and by the grace of God to shape this young man into what he became. Not just a warrior, but a great man of God who loved Jesus Christ. What is God calling us to do at Christ Church? He is calling us to honor and glorify Him and to share, not for the sake of our children, for the sake of all others. Amen.